Okay. Yep, this is Renaissance Medicine, revision session 2, Renaissance Medicine. I'll be going through the same format as before, the same one as the last time. I'll be going through some key terminology about causes, treatments and prevention. Make sure you differentiate those. If you get asked a question in the exam that asks you to comment on causes, make sure you talk about causes and not treatment and so on. So causes, treatments and prevention. Then I'll be looking at 11AS, IIAS, individuals, institutions, attitudes and science and technology, bearing in mind the importance of impact. And we'll look quickly at the Great Plague as the case study, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on change and continuity. I'm going to rattle through these though because we're up against it for time, and I want to try and keep these to no more than 20-25 minutes at a time. Okay, so key terminology. We have a lot of continuity in terms of beliefs about the causes of disease, but we are starting to blame some external factors. People are starting to look at the weather. Okay, so that's your main external factor. People have begun to say, well, you get certain types of disease in cold weather and hot weather and so on. So external factors are becoming more of a popular belief about the cause of disease. And we've also got a very, very small minority of doctors, physicians, rejecting the four humours. So you've got Paracelsus and Thomas Sydenham. Paracelsus is like Cher, he's just got one word name, right? So Paracelsus and Thomas Sydenham reject the four humours. Thomas Sydenham also managed to prove that scarlet fever and measles were separate diseases. People thought that they were the same disease because they look very similar, but he managed to prove that they are separate diseases. We still have some continuity though. Miasmata or miasma is still believed as a big cause, and still a lot of people are believing in supernatural and religious causes, particularly at the time of big epidemics. Okay, new treatments. Well, it's not really new, but it's got a name now. It seemed not to have a name when we looked at the medieval period, but it's now called transference or transference, and that's when you stick a chicken bottom or a frog around your neck, and the hope is that the disease will be passed on to the chicken or the frog or whatever it is you've got attached to the blister or the bubo or whatever it is. It will be transferred to that creature and leave you. Absolute nonsense, obviously, but that was a belief in the Renaissance period. I should quickly point out, of course, we're talking about the Renaissance period. That is 1500 to 1750. Make sure you bug your question whenever you're asked about a particular time period. Make sure you make it relevant to the time period or periods, and we're looking at 1500 to 1750 with the Renaissance period, okay? So back to treatments. We've got new remedies from the New World, complementing the kind of herbal remedies that are sold by apothecaries and wise women. We've now got new herbs and spices coming from the New World. Sarsaparilla for the pox. Ipecac, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right or not. Ipecac, but that's used for dysentery. This is like a herb, a plant-based remedy that's come from the New World. The New World, if you don't know, is America. Okay, remember, it was discovered, in inverted commas, towards the end of the 15th century, and throughout the 1500s and 1600s, new treatments are making their way back over in the ships of merchants, and sarsaparilla for pox and ipecac for dysentery. We've also got quinine for malaria. Quinine is what's in tonic water till today. And it comes from the bark of the cinchona tree. Okay, tea, coffee, and chocolate, or cocoa. They are obviously new things that have come from the New World. We've also got this new method of treatment called iatrochemistry. Iatrochemistry, but you can see it's there on the left of the screen. Iatrochemistry. That's treating illnesses with chemicals, elements. Mercury for syphilis. Effective at sorting out the syphilis. Unfortunately, it gives you mercury poisoning. An antimony element with the symbol SB, antimony. It's an emetic. That's a posh word for it makes you sick. Okay, so antimony to make you sick. It's a purgative. They were still purging the body. Okay, so although some doctors have left the idea of the four humours behind, like Paracelsus and Sydenham, we're still purging the body of bad things. Like if you feel ill, take an emetic, take some antimony, make you feel better. Preventions, moving on to preventions. We've still got regimen sanitatis, and we've got this idea of all things in moderation. Okay, have a little bit of what you fancy, that's fine, but don't indulge. That's a good way of preventing illness. We've still got cleanliness, but it's kind of mixed with this fear of bathing, because syphilis has been linked to bathing houses, probably because of the naughty things that go on in bathing houses in the Renaissance, but the link has been made, and so Henry VIII, in his wisdom, closed down a load of bathing houses. So that affected people's ability to stay clean. So what they did was they wore clean clothes, but they didn't necessarily clean their own bodies. So that's an attempt to prevent illness. Changing your clothes, but not necessarily cleaning your body. And barometers as a way of looking, checking the weather. Use barometers to check the weather, and maybe make a link between the disease and the weather. Okay, moving on to 11AS, individuals, institutions, attitudes, and science and technology. New individuals, I've already mentioned Paracelsus and Sydenham, for rejecting the four humours. We've got Andreas Vesalius, who wrote his famous book on the fabric of the human body, and he was helped, of course, by Titian, the artist, who painted his famous muscle men images. Sydenham wrote a book called Observations Medici, or Medical Observations, and Sydenham's very famous for revolutionising the way that doctors operated. Remember, he said, observe the patient. Don't just necessarily look in a textbook written by Galen to decide how to treat people. Actually observe the patient and come up with a sensible course of action and treatment based on what the symptoms are that the patient is presenting with. He also, and a little bit more on Thomas Sydenham, he also used quinine. He was the guy that used quinine first, or certainly he was famous for using quinine for malaria. And I'll park Sydenham for a minute. I'll come back to Sydenham later. We've got William Harvey, who was the guy who came up with the circulation of the blood. From observing a fire pump in action, and it sort of inspired him, and he cut lots of animals open. He tended to experiment on reptiles, cold-blooded animals, because their hearts are slower, and he could observe the circulation of the blood more clearly. And we've got Robert Hooke, who was a guy who pioneered the use of microscopes, and he wrote a very famous book, illustrated a famous book called Micrographia, which is lots of close-up drawings of fleas and insects and things like that. So these are our individuals. We've also got the important institutions. Institutions, remember, are organisations that play a role, either holding back progress or driving progress forward. So our important institutions here are the church. Now, the decline of the power of the church is what we're interested in the Renaissance period, the Reformation. With the rise of Protestantism, the power of the Catholic Church declined, and people were more able and willing to challenge accepted beliefs about disease, particularly those of Galen. Okay, so Galen starts to be challenged, notably by Vesalius and Harvey, and Sydenham as well. We've also got a new institution, the Royal Society, the first scientific organisation devoted to scientific progress, and it started here in England by Charles II in 1660, and its famous magazine, Philosophical Transactions, which you can still get today. It's still being published, the longest running scientific journal, and lots of fantastic new discoveries are published in Philosophical Transactions by the Royal Society. And people go and share experiments and share knowledge, and it's a way of driving forward change. Okay, we've also got government as an institution, particularly the government of Charles II, for obviously sponsoring the founding of the Royal Society, so that was an important thing. Charles II did that. He's also important when it comes to the Great Plague, but we'll look at him again in a minute. Hospitals. Hospitals went down. The decline of hospitals in the Renaissance period. That's interesting, isn't it? You think things should be going forward, but no. Hospitals declined because of the Reformation, because a lot of hospitals were run by the Catholic Church, and Henry VIII closed down a lot of monasteries during the Reformation, and so a lot of hospitals were closed as well. So we get a lot of the burden of care is being put back on women, as it always had been, but women in the home is where most of the care is carried out. There are exceptions. We have pest houses now, particular types of hospital for particular diseases. For example, leprosy. You have leprosy, you go to a pest house for leprosy, or leper's house. When we get the plague, we get plague houses, particularly on the continent. plague houses. They're a type of pest house, so it's a specific type of hospital for a specific disease. So you get asked a question about hospital care and how hospitals have changed, then you can talk about pest houses. You can talk about how Henry VIII closed down the monasteries and so closed down a lot of hospitals as well. A final institution that I've missed out are guilds. Guilds are like a little bit like trade unions of their time. So for surgeons and apothecaries, they would be expected to join a guild, and that would give them some kind of professional respect, if you like. So you could prove that you were a proper apothecary or a proper surgeon by being a member of a guild and showing your guild certificate. It made it less likely for people to be able to pass themselves off as surgeons without actually having any qualifications. So it professionalised things, the guilds. Moving on to attitudes, humanism is the big attitude. It's all about, scientific. It's the precursor to the Enlightenment. It's the beginning of science and progress and human improvement. Just advancing things against the power of the church to kind of hold back progress. Humanism is a way of moving things forward, putting the human at the centre of things. We've also got scientific curiosity, the beginning of science, really, as a discipline, or a respected, accepted discipline. We've also got war. I've put that in attitudes. It doesn't really fit in attitudes. I understand it's not really a warlike attitude, but it helped in some degree, and I couldn't think of where else to put it. But William Harvey, for example, was a Civil War doctor, and he was able to observe the circulation of the blood thanks to a lot of those wounds that he was able to treat on the battlefield. Science and technology. I'll do science first. The Royal Society promoted the scientific approach, and technology then. Technology is a big one here. From ancient times through medieval times, we've got very little technological progress. Monks are writing books. If you want a book writing, you have to painstakingly write it out. But now we've got the printing press, big thing. Johannes Gutenberg, Guttenberg, the first printing press in Europe, and subsequently all these new books are able to be printed in their thousands. So learning is disseminated. We take books for granted, but they were a massive thing. They were like the internet of their day, and they spread knowledge around the world. Obviously we've got the microscope, as shown by Robert Hooke and his Micrographia. Not as powerful as they could be at this time. I mean, you can see insects close up, but you can't see germs yet. And of course the water pump that inspired William Harvey and blood circulation. Okay. So moving on to the case study, the Great Plague. Remember, this is different from the Black Death. 1348 was the Black Death. 320 years later or whatever, we've got the Great Plague. 1665. Some nice statistics for you to remember. 7,000 deaths in 1 week. 100,000 Londoners died during the course of the epidemic. Always note the change in continuity between the two outbreaks. Same disease, both bubonic plague, both Yersinia pestis, right? Same bacteria, but there are similarities and differences in the way that people believed it was caused by certain things. Similarities and differences in the way people treated it, and similarities and differences in the way it was prevented. Okay, so causes, in beliefs about the causes, we've still got this belief that it was caused by God, still got a belief in astrology and the alignment of the planets, still got a belief in miasma. This was the most common cause, as people believed. We've still got the belief that wells were poisoned, but not the Jews. The Jews are not responsible in 1665. It's believed that Catholics are responsible rather than the Jews. So the enemy has changed, if you like, because don't forget, we're right in the middle of the wars of religion and the Reformation. So Catholics are blamed rather than Jews this time. Four humours still blamed by the ignorant masses, but by and large, for those people who work in the medical field are no longer blaming the four humours. Prevention, beliefs about prevention. Lots of similarities, still using potions, posies, sweet-smelling herbs to keep the miasma away, or just legging it, getting the hell out of Dodge. That'll getting away from the disease, that might help. Astrology, consulting astrological charts, checking out the alignment of the planets to see if that helps. So a lot of supernatural beliefs and similarities, and some practical beliefs are still continued. But we do have a change. Charles II, remember, Charles II is the king now. I said I'd come back to him. He did more than Edward III did in 1348 because he could do more. Remember, Edward III had no real method of enforcing his quarantine laws. Charles II did. He employed watchmen to make sure that people didn't leave their houses. He ordered the streets to be fumigated. He believed that he was keeping the miasma away. So for a couple of days, couple of nights, he ordered the streets of London to be fumigated. Little fires were being set at crossroads across London, and the fumes, it was believed, would keep the miasma away. Now, it actually worked. It did reduce the outbreak. It did reduce the incidence of fresh cases of the plague. Not for the reasons Charles II thought, though. It was because the mice just don't come out to play when there's smoke around, there's fires around, so they tend to stay holed up in their homes, and so there are fewer fleas being attracted to human bodies, and so less plague is being spread around. So it did work, and Charles II was able to do that, except a few days into that process, it rained and put all the fires out. People were ordered to fast. Theatres were closed, the streets were swept, cats and dogs were killed, and watchmen were paid to enforce the quarantine, as I mentioned. Parliament was also closed. These were all ways of keeping the outbreak to a minimum. And to a degree, it was more effective than Edward III's efforts in 1348, 300 years earlier. Okay, so be aware of that change. Treatments. We've got some new treatments. Plague doctors, the famous plague doctor with the beak on the nose and the leather jacket and the gloves, effective at preventing the wearer from getting the disease. Not for the reasons that people believe, though. That big beak is filled with sweet-smelling herbs to keep the miasma away. Actually, just wearing a big long leather coat stopped fleas getting to you, so you were less likely to get the plague because of that outfit. Also, it meant that if a plague victim breathed or coughed on you, you weren't able to inhale their phlegm and blood, so you didn't catch pneumonic plague. And remember, pneumonic plague is always fatal. We've still got purging, we've still got draining the buboes, we've still got plague houses, but we've got new herbal treatments. Apothecaries are now selling plague water, so that's a new one. Plague water, like a medicine. It doesn't work, but it was something. So briefly, let's recap on changing continuity. We've got some changes that I've not mentioned. Doctors have rejected urine charts. You'll remember that physicians used urine charts. The colour of the wee was believed to kind of be a big signal as to what was wrong with a person. That's been rejected, so that's a change. We've also got the rejection of the four humours by Paracelsus and Sydenham, among others. We've got the rejection of supernatural causes, except for big epidemics. We've got the decline of the church. New attitude is humanism, meant more curiosity about anatomy and the cause of diseases. We've got new diagnosis, Thomas Sydenham's observation and his Observations Medicae, his book. New treatment, transference, and new remedies from the New World, quinine, sarsaparilla, coffee, cocoa, tea, ipecac for dysentery. We've got new technology as well, the printing press and the microscope. We've got surgeons and apothecaries are attached to guilds, and we've got hospitals closed down due to the Reformation. So we do have a lot of change, but we still have some continuity. Remember, the religion is still powerful. The power of the church might have declined, but everybody still believes in God. So we've got a lot of religion is believed to cause disease. Miasma is still blamed because we don't know about germs yet. Four humours is still believed by ordinary people, even if some of the more educated doctors have rejected it. Life expectancy is still low. So despite all, that's a big one, despite all these new ideas that are coming out from Vesalius and Harvey about how the human body works, great leaps forward in terms of anatomical knowledge, life expectancy is unaffected. People still die relatively young because it's not spilled over into treatments yet. There's no real effective treatments to speak of. There's experiments with iatrochemistry and new herbal remedies, but by and large there is no real advance in treatments. Most care is still done by women at home. Operations are still done by barber surgeons, not physicians, and people still use regimen sanitators, so we have a lot of continuity alongside all that change. And that is your lot done inside 20 minutes. Brilliant.